Number 1. Final Fantasy VII originally had a smaller development team than Final Fantasy VI had. While the development team on Final Fantasy VI had somewhere between 50 and 60 members attached to the project. When Final Fantasy VII started in late 1994, there were literally half the number of people working on it. Director of Final Fantasy VII, Yoshinori Kitase, stated in an interview that the small team started pre-production work very slowly, and it was originally going to be a Super Nintendo RPG that focused on the investigation of an organization that were blowing up reactors, led by a character called Hot-Blooded Detective Joe. The game was to be set in New York City, and one member of that organization was the prototype character of the one and only Cloud Strife. There's only one screenshot of the game at this point in development seen here, but I don't know. This doesn't quite look like anything set in New York to me. Not long after this point, all 20 to 30 members of this development team were brought in to help with the making of Chrono Trigger, and this version of Final Fantasy VII was completely abandoned. The idea of a game in the city of New York carried over to another Square game in 1998 called Parasite Eve, but I think we all knew that one. Number 2. Square had just under 1 year to complete Final Fantasy VII. After Chrono Trigger hit the shelves, the entire team at Square moved very quickly to make character designs and enemy prototypes for the new Final Fantasy game. They were working extensively with new machines to make polygon-based designs for the N64, as Nintendo and Square had a wonderful relationship at the time. Those few months of work were completely flushed down the toilet though, once series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi announced in a very nonchalant manner that this new Final Fantasy was gonna be made using Sony's new console, the PlayStation. In early 1996, Square spent millions for new hardware and development kits, and they did everything they could to bring in new artists and developers, and soon the team had nearly 200 members. All they had to do now was learn how to use those new systems and pieces of hardware. Everything they bought was cutting edge and brand new, so they scrambled quickly to learn as much as they could about them as they were creating the game. Eventually, they became so good at using the PlayStation for development, Square essentially cleaned up some of their own coding and programming techniques to give back to Sony so that everyone developing games for this system could make things more effective, after Sony was reluctant to give Square direct access to its internal hardware. Here's a fun tidbit. Have you ever wondered why this scene takes so long to load in? That's actually the fault of series composer Nobuo Uematsu. During the development of Final Fantasy VII, Nobuo wanted to incorporate better sounds and actual voices into the game to make a better and more atmospheric soundtrack. Those better sounds and actual voices caused load times to be much slower, and as such, it created this moment, which actually works really well in the end, in my opinion. It adds tension to the final boss fight and makes the players sit in this moment where they don't really know what's gonna happen next, when all of a sudden, the song kicks in and the player sits helpless until finally the screen loads in. You can blame Nobuo for that moment. Or you can also blame the specs of the PS1, I don't know. Anyway, number 3. Aerith wasn't the only death that was planned in the game. I really hope I'm not spoiling anything at this point by saying any of that, but the saddest video game death in history was originally going to be one of many throughout the course of the game. Do you remember the point in the game where you pick a team and parachute into the city of Midgar in the second half of the game? Well, originally, Kitase wanted the members of the party that you didn't pick all to die in some way right after that. Which, I mean, Kitase is also responsible for Celeste's suicide scene in Final Fantasy VI. So I mean, it's not necessarily out of his wheelhouse to present this idea. Click this card to see my video on Final Fantasy VI facts you probably never knew. But it was actually character designer and artist Tetsuya Nomura who talked Kitase out of having that happen, saying ultimately that if all of the other characters were to die, it would soften the absolutely massive impact of having Aerith die in such a pivotal moment. The funny part is, when Nomura was retelling the story, Kitase didn't remember it until the parachute scene was brought up, and then he confirmed it. Number 4. Final Fantasy VII's development period led to the offices in Honolulu opening not only to help with game development in general, but to also make movies. This is the studio that ultimately led to the release of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within in 2001, and series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi stepping away from Square slowly. It was around this time that Sakaguchi thought that since Final Fantasy VII had so many cutscenes, movies could be the next venture for Square and the Final Fantasy series. So he focused very strictly on movies during this time, and having the studio open and make those movies was such an ambitious process, they attempted to completely build their pipeline of movie-making development in a 2-year span. For some context, this is something that would normally take studios upwards of 10 years to do, Pixar being the notable studio referenced here. The release of The Spirits Within actually led to Square being financially in the red for the first time ever. They delayed Final Fantasy X, and that's when Sakaguchi stepped down from Square, feeling as if everything was essentially his fault. And as most of us already know, after he stepped down, that's when everything started to change massively at Square. The developers thought that Square started suffering from, quote, big company disease, which ultimately meant that everything that Square was to do from that point forward came down to cost, not creativity. Number 5. Sakaguchi 100% trusts Kitase with the remake of Final Fantasy VII. In a recent interview with Sakaguchi, it was asked what he thought of the remake, and it really came down to him saying that he believed the remake was being developed with the same energy and spirit as the original was, and that he was eager to see how it plays out not only as the father of the series, but as a player of it as well. Sakaguchi went on to say that with current-gen hardware, Kitase can finally fully flesh out his original ideas for the game that they couldn't necessarily do in 1997 due to limitations in the hardware itself. He complimented Kitase quite a bit, saying that the Final Fantasy series was improved a lot due to the talents of Kitase. And to me, that's huge. I mean, it's already a widely known fact that Sakaguchi loves where Final Fantasy XIV went, so to hear him give praise to the remake is a really good bookend to an amazing game with quite the development story behind it. Oh, also, by the way, if you're fairly new to the series, or maybe just haven't played in a long time, check out this video where I start mapping out the starting points of this amazing series.